Between the years 1872 and 1878, 11 men entered St. Brendan's Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as novice priests. The official departure ledger, maintained by the rector himself, recorded all 11 as having voluntarily left the institution, withdrawn, it said, returned to secular life. The death records held in the basement of the same building recorded all 11 as deceased. The dates in the departure ledger and the death records did not match. In 6 of the 11 cases, the official departure date, the date the rector logged as the day each man walked out of those gates, came after the date of death recorded in the basement. 11 men entered, 11 men died. The ledger said they left. A journalist named Edmund Farrell found the ledger in the winter of 1879. He was not looking for it. He was looking for something else entirely. What he found changed him so completely that he never worked as a journalist again. His final letter, written to his editor the night before he was admitted to Hahnemann Hospital, said only, "The worst part is not what they did. The worst part is why. Their logic was perfect. That is what I cannot survive." This is the story of St. Brendan's Seminary, the 11 men who entered and never left, and the reporter who got close enough to the truth that the truth destroyed him.
This channel investigates mysteries that history tried to bury. Cases that were sealed, suppressed, or deliberately destroyed because they threatened people with power. Before we reveal what happened inside the walls of St. Brendan's Seminary in Philadelphia, hit subscribe. We release one deep investigation every week. Next week, we're releasing a case from Kentucky, 1864, a freedmen's church where 12 members vanished inside a single winter. That investigation is already complete. The only question is whether you'll be here when we release it. Drop a comment right now. What state are you watching from? Because what happened in Pennsylvania has echoes in every state where an institution was given power and no one asked questions. To understand St. Brendan's, you have to understand Philadelphia in 1872. The Civil War had been over for 7 years, but the country was still bleeding in ways that didn't show on maps. The economy had collapsed in the panic of 1873. Unemployment carved through working families like a cold wind through bad insulation. Into this uncertainty stepped the Catholic Church, and in Philadelphia particularly, the church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was a social infrastructure. Hospitals, schools, orphanages, employment networks. For Irish and German immigrant communities packed into South Philadelphia's cramped row houses, the church was the first call when something went wrong, and often the last. St. Brendan's Seminary occupied a property at the northeastern edge of the city, a 3-acre compound behind an iron perimeter fence, established in 1849 for the formation of diocesan priests. The main building was a 4-story stone structure, severe in the way that Protestant churches are warm. Its windows were narrow. Its interior corridors were designed for silence. Novices were discouraged from correspondence with their families during their first year of formation. This was explained as spiritual discipline. The church had a phrase for it, a period of sacred severance. The rector of St. Brendan's from 1869 through 1881 was a man named Father Cornelius Voss. He was 61 years old in 1872. He had administered the seminary for 3 years before the first novice died. He was well regarded by the diocese, methodical, precise. His annual reports to the Bishop of Philadelphia were noted in the bishop's own correspondence for their exceptional clerical detail. That clerical detail is what eventually destroyed him. His ledger was too precise, and Edmund Farrell was too careful not to notice.
Edmund Farrell was 34 years old in January of 1879, and he had been a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 9 years. He was not a religious man. He had been raised Catholic in the Fishtown neighborhood, 3 blocks from the Delaware River, and he had lost his faith, he later wrote, gradually the way a candle loses its height, so slowly you don't notice until there's nothing left. He was not hostile to the church. He simply didn't think about it much. He covered municipal politics, corruption in the water board, irregularities in city contracting. He was the kind of reporter who found numbers soothing. They meant something, or they didn't. They matched, or they didn't. In January of 1879, Farrell was not investigating St. Brendan's. He was investigating the diocese's property records, a story about land purchased by the diocese in 1876 at prices that suggested a relationship with the city assessor's office. It was a mundane story. He expected it to lead nowhere. The property records took him to the diocese administrative offices on Arch Street. The clerk there was cooperative. Most of what Farrell needed was in the public-facing files. But one folder he was handed by accident, placed inside the property ledger he had requested, was not a property record at all. It was a carbon copy of St. Brendan's internal departure log, a routine administrative document. Farrell almost set it aside without reading it. He did not set it aside. Later he would write, "I cannot explain why I read it. I have tried to find a rational reason. Perhaps it was the format, columns of names and dates, which is the language I think in. Perhaps it was the word departed, appearing 11 times in 6 years. Something in the frequency made me count." He counted. He wrote the dates in his notebook. That evening, he visited the Philadelphia Register of Vital Records and requested the death certificates for the names on the list. 6 of the 11 certificates showed death dates that preceded the departure dates recorded in Father Vosser's ledger. One of the certificates showed a man named Patrick Nolan, departed, per the ledger, March 14, 1876, who had, per the Register of Vital Records, died of cardiac failure on February 28, 1876, and had been buried in the St. Brendan's private grounds on March 2nd. According to Father Voss's records, Patrick Nolan had walked out the gates of St. Brendan's 12 days after he was in the ground. Farrell went home that night. He sat at his kitchen table. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he wrote a single question in his notebook. Who else knows? But what Edmund Farrell was about to discover wasn't just a clerical error, because clerical errors don't bury their mistakes. If this story is already giving you chills, share it with someone who loves dark history. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a case. Let's find out what was really happening inside those walls.
Farrell spent 3 weeks gathering what he could without entering the seminary itself. The 11 men on the departure ledger were Patrick Nolan, 23 years old, from County Sligo, Ireland, arrived St. Brendan's September 1872, logged as departed March 14, 1876, death certificate February 28, 1876, cause of death cardiac failure. Thomas Daly, 26 years old, from Cork, Ireland, arrived St. Brendan's January 1873, logged as departed June 3, 1874, death certificate May 19, 1874, cause of death pneumonia. Joseph Brennan, 21 years old, from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, arrived St. Brendan's March 1874, logged as departed October 8, 1875, death certificate September 30, 1875, cause of death heart failure. Farrell tracked down the families. This was slow work. Several of the men had emigrated from Ireland and had no known relatives in Pennsylvania. 2 had come from rural counties in the state. One, Thomas Daly, had a sister living in South Philadelphia, a woman named Margaret Daly, who worked as a seamstress in a factory near the Navy Yard. Farrell found her on a Tuesday afternoon in February 1879. He described the meeting in his notebook with unusual care.
She was perhaps 30. She worked at a table near the south window where the light was better. When I told her I was making inquiries about her brother, she did not ask why. She said very quietly, "They told us he left. We wrote to the address they gave us. The letters came back unopened. We stopped writing after a year." She did not cry. She looked at the window. She said, "We always thought he was ashamed of us, that he'd found a better life and didn't want us in it." I did not tell her what I had found. I did not know yet what I had found. Farrell began writing to former seminarians, men who had left St. Brendan's before the pattern began, or who had transferred to other institutions. He found 3 men willing to speak. All 3 told him the same thing about Father Voss, independently and without coordination. He believed in what he called the refinement of the body through the acceptance of suffering. He had developed over years of administration a theology of physical mortification that went significantly beyond standard church practice. He believed that sickness, genuine sickness, not performed penance, was the body's purest form of spiritual submission, that when a man's body failed, his soul was, at that moment, closest to God. One of the former seminarians, a man named Alphonse Reed, who had left St. Brendan's in 1871, told Farrell this. He used to say that most priests would never know God because their bodies were too healthy, that comfort was the enemy of faith. He wasn't violent, he didn't hurt anyone directly, he just managed the environment. He believed that a cold enough room, combined with insufficient nutrition, combined with sustained isolation from family and friends, would produce in certain men a state of spiritual perfection. He genuinely believed the suffering was a gift. Farrell wrote in his notebook, underlined twice, he was not sadistic, he was convinced he was doing something holy. Then Farrell went to the register of deaths again. He requested every death certificate recorded at St. Brendan's address from 1869, the year Voss arrived, through 1878. He was prepared for 11 names. There were 19. 8 additional deaths had not appeared in the departure ledger at all. They were simply recorded as dying at the address, cause listed as illness, and buried in the private grounds. Voss had not needed to log them as departures. They had died before they were formally enrolled as novices during the initial formation period. The church had no formal requirement to report these deaths to the diocese. The rector's authority over his own institution during that era was effectively absolute. 19 men in 9 years. The average age, 24 years old. The Diocese of Philadelphia had received no notification of a pattern. The bishop, in his later deposition, stated that he had been aware of deaths at the seminary, that he had understood them as the natural consequence of housing large numbers of young men in close quarters during years of epidemic illness. He stated that he had not questioned Father Voss's reports because Father Voss's reports were impeccably organized. The reports were so clean, the columns were perfect, the numbers all reconciled. I had no reason to look deeper. Farrell read that statement later and wrote beside it in the margin of his own copy, "Clean columns, perfect numbers. That is what 19 men's lives looked like when processed through the mind of a man who believed their deaths were a theological achievement." What Farrell found when he finally entered the seminary walls was something that the official investigation would later describe as a record of institutional conviction, not malice, not chaos, something far more disturbing. If this story is reaching you, share it, hit like, subscribe. The full picture is coming, and it is worse than the numbers.
In March of 1879, Farrell went to the diocese and made a formal complaint. He brought his notebook, his copies of the death certificates, and the carbon copy of the departure ledger. The meeting was with a diocesan administrator, not the bishop, a man named Monsignor Gerard Howell. Farrell described Monsignor Howell as a careful man, a man who listened without reacting, who asked questions in a way that felt like listening but was actually recording. After 40 minutes, Monsignor Howell told Farrell that the matter would be investigated internally. He thanked Farrell for bringing his concerns forward. He asked that Farrell refrain from publishing until the internal review was complete, as publication during an ongoing investigation could prejudice the process. Farrell agreed to a period of 30 days. He went back to the Inquirer and told his editor, a man named Claude Wentworth, what he had found. Wentworth did not touch the story for 3 weeks. Farrell later wrote that the editor seemed frightened, and he meant the word precisely, not professionally cautious, but personally afraid. Wentworth had a daughter enrolled in a Catholic school. He had a wife who sang in the choir at St. Patrick's. He told Farrell to continue gathering evidence, but to write nothing publishable until Farrell had something that could not be walked back. On March 29, 1879, Farrell gained access to the seminary itself. He was admitted by a novice who had been told only that a municipal inspector was on the grounds. The records room was unlocked. The building smelled of old stone and something beneath that, damp wool, weak soup, the particular cold that accumulates in rooms where the heating is kept low enough to count as frugality. In the records room, behind a filing cabinet, Farrell found a leather notebook, not the departure ledger, a private journal. It belonged to Father Voss. He stood in the records room for 40 minutes reading it. He later wrote, "I have never been a man given to physical responses to information. I have read murder trial transcripts without trembling. I have reported on the aftermath of industrial accidents without losing my composure. I stood in that room and my hands shook so badly I had to set the journal down and press them flat against the filing cabinet to make them stop. Not because Father Voss was a monster in the way that word is commonly understood, because he was not. His handwriting was precise. His sentences were elegant. He cited Augustine. He cited Aquinas. He described the deaths of 11 men. He named them, I recognized the names, with an equanimity that was in itself the most terrifying document I have ever encountered. He was not confessing. He was not hiding. He was recording what he believed were spiritual triumphs. The journal was explicit. Father Voss had identified, upon arrival at St. Brendan's, what he described as an opportunity for authentic formation that conventional seminary practice had abandoned in favor of comfort. He had deliberately maintained the dormitories at temperatures that he calculated would weaken the body's resistance and strengthen the spirit's dominance. He had reduced caloric provision to the threshold of discomfort without crossing into incapacitation. He had restricted family correspondence as spiritual practice, which also functioned, he noted, to prevent families from learning of the men's deterioration until it was too late to remove them. He had never intended to kill anyone. He had intended to bring them to the threshold of death, where he believed God's presence was most accessible, and guide them back. The men who did not come back, he wrote, had simply achieved the full passage that he had been guiding them toward. He described their deaths as successful formation. "I do not grieve them," he wrote in the final entry of the journal, dated November 3, 1878. "I envy them the fullness of what they found. My own body is too strong. I have not yet been granted the gift I have given others." Farrell took nothing from the room. He left the journal where he found it. He walked out of St. Brendan's Seminary, got 2 blocks from the iron gate, and stopped on the sidewalk in the cold March air. He stood there for a time he later described as long enough to understand that I had changed. A woman passing him on the street asked him if he was all right. He told her he was. He was not. He filed his story with Wentworth the next morning. Wentworth read it twice. He said, "If we run this, they will come for us." Farrell said, "They are already in the record. All we are doing is saying it out loud." The Inquirer published on April 4, 1879. The story ran on the front page. It named Father Voss. It named the diocese. It named all 11 men from the departure ledger and listed their actual death dates. It named the 8 additional deaths the diocese had not been required to report. It named Margaret Daly, Thomas Daly's sister, and printed what she had said in the seamstress's factory by the south window. "We always thought he was ashamed of us." The diocese's response came within 48 hours of publication, not a denial, something more difficult to answer. If you want to know how an institution protects itself, how it absorbs a scandal without breaking, what happened next is a masterclass in institutional survival. Subscribe so you're here when we continue. Let's finish this together.
The Diocese of Philadelphia issued a statement on April 6, 1879. It did not deny the deaths. It could not deny the deaths.
The death certificates were public record, and the Inquirer had printed copies. What the statement did instead was establish, very carefully, a framework for understanding Father Voss that placed the institution outside the circle of accountability. The statement described Father Voss as a priest whose theological convictions had, with great sadness, departed from the sound doctrine of the Church. It said he had acted independently and without the knowledge or sanction of the diocese. It announced that Father Voss had been relieved of his position at St. Brendan's, pending further review. Father Voss was not arrested on April 6th. He was not arrested for another 11 weeks. The case passed through 3 different courts before a charge was formally filed. The charge, when it came, was criminal negligence, not murder. The distinction was significant. Criminal negligence required proving that Voss had failed a duty of care. Murder required proving intent to kill. The prosecution argued negligence. The defense argued theology, that Voss had believed sincerely that what he was doing was spiritually beneficial, and that sincere belief, however misguided, was not criminal intent. The trial lasted 6 days in September 1879. Farrell attended every session. He wrote in his notebook, "I watch the defense and I understand their argument. I understand it because I have read the journal. He did believe it. That is the truth. The problem is that truth is not a defense. 19 men are in the ground." The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on criminal negligence. Father Cornelius Voss was sentenced to 4 years in the Eastern State Penitentiary on Fairmount Avenue, less than 4 miles from the seminary where he had spent 9 years managing the deaths of the men he believed he was saving. He served 22 months. He was released in 1881 on grounds of declining health. He died in 1983 in a private room at a Catholic hospital in Germantown. His obituary in the Catholic Standard described him as a priest of deep and sincere faith. The obituary did not mention St. Brendan's Seminary. The diocese made 11 financial settlements with the families of the men named in Farrell's article. The amounts were not disclosed. The settlements included a confidentiality agreement. Margaret Daly, Thomas's sister, did not sign. She told the diocese's lawyer that she did not want money. She wanted her brother's name on the list of the dead rather than the list of the departed. The diocese did not alter its records. The departure ledger, last Farrell checked, remained as written. Of the 8 additional deaths, the men who had died during the initial formation period and were never logged as departures, the diocese argued that the statute of limitations had expired and that no living responsible party could be identified. No charges were filed in connection with those 8 deaths. 6 of the 8 families were never formally notified of the outcome of the case. 3 of those families spent years believing their sons had abandoned them. Farrell published the follow-up stories through the spring and summer of 1879. By August, Wentworth, his editor, had received 3 letters from diocesan lawyers. Farrell was not fired. He was instead given a new beat, municipal sanitation contracts. He accepted the reassignment without complaint. He published nothing further about St. Brendan's. In December of 1879, Farrell submitted a formal resignation from the Inquirer. His letter to Wentworth, which Wentworth kept and which was recovered from his estate files in 1932, read, "I have covered this city for 9 years. I have written about men who took money, men who took power, men who took lives in moments of violence. I know how to report on those men. I do not know how to report on a man who was certain, absolutely, irreducibly certain, that he was doing good. There is no story I can tell that reaches the center of that. The center is a place where logic and horror become the same thing. I am not equipped to live in that place and continue to function." Farrell was admitted to Hahnemann Hospital in February 1820, suffering from what the admitting physician described as acute nervous collapse and persistent sleeplessness. He was discharged in May 1820. He did not return to journalism.
He worked for the rest of his life as a clerk in a shipping office near Penn's Landing. His colleagues there described him uniformly as a quiet man who arrived on time, made no errors, and never spoke of his previous work. He died in 1909. His personal effects included 6 notebooks, the original notebooks from his investigation. His death certificate listed his occupation as clerk. St. Brendan's Seminary remained open until 1891, when declining enrollment led the diocese to consolidate it with another institution. The building was sold in 1894 to a private buyer and converted in the early 20th century to apartments. It was demolished in 1947. The private grounds where 19 men were buried were incorporated into the development of the surrounding neighborhood. There is no marker. The street that runs through what was once the St. Brendan's compound is now a residential block in northeast Philadelphia. People live there. The departure ledger, Father Voss's meticulous, damning, perfect departure ledger, was entered into evidence during the 1879 trial and retained as a court document. It was transferred to the Pennsylvania State Archive in 1911 as part of a routine consolidation of older court records. It sits there now in a document box cataloged under the criminal case number, available to any researcher who requests it. Farrell's 6 notebooks were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1923 by his widow. They are available for viewing by appointment. His handwriting, scholars have noted, is exceptionally clear, precise, even-spaced, no corrections. A reporter's hand, trained to get it right the first time. Of the 19 men buried in the private grounds of St. Brendan's Seminary, 11 were formally named in Farrell's reporting. 8 were not. Their names appeared only in the death certificates Farrell found in the register. Most of those 8 names do not appear in any other public document. They arrived in Philadelphia. They entered the seminary. The city has no further record of them. Margaret Daly, Thomas's sister, lived until 1921. She is buried in a Catholic cemetery in South Philadelphia. Her gravestone, which her daughter arranged, includes a secondary inscription below her own name. It reads, Thomas Patrick Daly, 1847 to 1874. Beloved, he did not leave. If you had been Edmund Farrell, standing in that records room with your hands shaking, reading a journal in which a man described 19 deaths with the equanimity of a gardener logging a good harvest, what would you have taken from the room? Would you have taken the journal? Would you have left it where it was? Would you have run? Farrell left it where it was. He left the room. He wrote the story. He never recovered from either decision. This channel investigates what history decided to file away, cases where the official record and the true record are 2 different documents. Next week, Kentucky, 1864, a freedmen's church, 12 members, 1 winter. What the county recorded and what the congregation knew are not the same story. Subscribe so you're there when it comes out. Like this video if Farrell's story reached you, and share it, especially with someone who trusts the official record. The departure ledger was impeccably maintained, every column reconciled. 19 men disagreed.